All right, I think we're live. So hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel on why classic fantasy still resonates, hosted by FanFiAddict and SFFaddict. So I'm Michael Armella. I'm going to be moderating today for my sins. Hopefully all goes smoothly and no one has makes me trip myself up. But I think we'll start by having our panelists introduce themselves. And as Janice is the person I can see on my screen, I'm going to start with Janice.
Hi, I'm Janice, J.A. Andrews, and I do write a fairly classic brand of epic fantasy. There's even elves and dwarves and things reminiscent of Tolkien, but hopefully with a little bit more modern flair than Tolkien's work has today. But the more classic feel of fantasy is just, it's my jam. It's what I like reading, and it's what I love to write.
Brilliant. All right, let's someone else just hop in there. Go on. Who's going to be first? Right, you like to talk. On you go.
I was trying not to be the person who talks because of that fact. But yeah, I'm Ryan Cahill. Some people say Cahill. You're wrong, but it's okay. My debut series is The Bound and the Broken, which is like a classic epic fantasy, like a classic style fantasy told with a modern narrative. And we're currently on the 7th book. Yeah, 7th book, fourth main book, and with 3 novellas so far. So yeah, that's basically it.
Brilliant. Modupe?
Hello, I am Modupe. I write as M.H. Ayinde. My epic fantasy novel is coming out in 2025 with Orbit, and it's called A Song of Legends Lost. And yeah, I've always read epic fantasy and what I would class as classic fantasy, and it's the tone of all of my long fiction. I also write short fiction, and that's me.
Brilliant. And last but not least, go on, Phil.
Yeah, Philip's Quaintrell. People think I like to go by Phil, but I don't. I like everyone to call me Philip C. Quaintrell. So let's just get that right.
You hear that, guys, for tonight. It's Phil.
Let's just abbreviate it to P.
Yeah, I write. Like what you guys do. I write epic and classic fantasy. That is my jam. What have I done now? I think I'm on the Echo Saga, which is 9 books. The Ranger Archives, which is 3. I've just started Time of Dragons, but book 1 is out, and book 2 is on up to my neck in that, which is great.
Brilliant.
Phil writes a lot of books.
I guess I should,
very fast.
Yeah, there's a lot of books. Phil wins on book count. He could crush us with his books. I guess I should mention that my current series is called Songs of Chaos, and it is a big old Dragon Rider epic. So kind of writing in the same space there as Ryan and Philip, and a little more tonally similar to Eragon, but a little more modernized, harder magic system, that sort of thing. So it seems like we all like to focus on kind of what you might say a kind of traditional epic or high fantasy space. So that's a good place to start. So when we first put out word of this panel, what I saw that came back was quite a lot of people asking, will this be talking about a specific era or a specific set of authors? And I think that might be one route we can go down at some point. I know that some of you guys want to talk about that era. When people think of classic fantasy, I think they tend to think of the 80s. And so some people are wondering, does classic fantasy mean fantasy from the 80s, from a particular set of authors? Or is it actually, what I'm going to be suggesting we discuss about first, is that it's really like a style, like there's a sort of tone or a storytelling vibe that you can capture even now in the modern day, because otherwise none of us could be writing sort of in quotes classic fantasy or fantasy that feels classic, even though we're writing in 2023. So we'll start there for now. I wonder if we can try to find what that style of storytelling is, what that vibe of storytelling is. I'll throw it to Phil first. Do you want to have a crack at that?
No, don't.
That's going to be a hard no, Michael. PCQ wants to pass.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before, haven't we? Because it's what we write in, and I think we have put the nail in it there in terms of saying things like it feels genre to me. It doesn't feel like a period in time. I get that the word classic makes people a bit like music. It makes people think of a particular time period, and so therefore you sort of everything in that classic period is what we're talking about. But that is not how I take it. It's a genre, and if the genre is just in that time period, we're kind of saying that it doesn't really exist anymore. There's just the bones of it left. Whereas actually we're all proof that it is a genre. People love that genre, and it is still going, and it's rooted in what you were saying before about the dwarves and the elves and that kind of kingdom sort of situation and that realm. Very Tolkien-esque, I suppose. He's sort of, I want to say the godfather of it because that's kind of how he feels to me, but I know that there's some people out there that are like, no, he wasn't first, he didn't do it properly. But that's kind of how I've always seen it.
All right.
That was an amazing impression.
That was Tolkien.
I don't know how you managed to capture like millions of people in one voice, but that was beautiful.
Yeah. Good job.
I just saw someone mention Daughter of the Empire in the comments, and that series is one of the series that I read as a teenager that had a massive impact on me. And I actually read Magician after that. So Daughter of the Empire was written with Janny Wirtz, and then Feist's Magician books were him on his own. And I actually came to the Empire trilogy first. And I guess for me, that series, because it has quite a lot of personal stakes in it, it's not quite as what we might term classic as, say, something like Magician, but I think it's certainly one of the books that for me during that time, we're talking about sort of 80s, 90s, really introduced me to the genre and then led me to read Magician and some other things, even though I would say I came to the genre overall through Tolkien, like a lot of people. That's not answering the question, but I just saw someone mention that book, so I just wanted to mention it too.
We're all about rambling.
You can ramble away. Have a crack at the question now. Go on.
So I don't know that there are particular elements that I would expect in terms of types of creatures, things like that. For me, it's more. First of all, I think a lot of this comes from mythology and legend. The genre itself comes from that, and I think that what we term classic fantasy is, I think, closest to that. And I don't want to sort of get too far ahead in the discussion, but for me, a lot of it is about stakes, and a lot of it is about the scope of the story. And the focus, so not just personal stakes but world stakes. I don't want to say too much about stakes, so that's a large part of it. I would also tentatively say that I would expect more of a focus on some kind of magic than other sort of types of fantasy, so whether that be actual magic or magical creatures, for me, that's always been like a key element.
Sure. Janice, what do you think goes into this sort of style of fantasy that we're all playing in?
Well, so I grew up on the 80s and 90s fantasy, and I feel like it was just fantasy, right? Obviously, it makes me old. I was like,
Yeah.
classic. But
you don't look a day over 21.
Well, thanks. But I feel like once the more grim, dark books appeared on the scene, suddenly we needed a word now for what's not maybe either just the really low amounts of magic, or the classic fantasies tends to have the more heroic character, even if they're not like purely good or whatever, but there's a sense of heroism, there's kind of a sense of hope, there's the world's at stake. Yeah, horrible things might happen. Probably we're going to end up okay at the end. Like, probably the worst person is not going to end up as emperor of the world and just murder everybody. So I
Probably.
feel almost like this idea of classic fantasy, it didn't come into my world in my mind until there was something that had taken its place in the mainstream, which
Right.
was
Yeah.
just a darker, grittier kind of thing. And now today it's more challenging, right? Because I feel like when we say we write classic, there's still a spectrum of like how gritty we are or not gritty. You know, there's all sorts of tonal things in there, but it almost feels like a callback to like the tone that even like Marvel movies have or something like that, right? There's big stakes, the good, but there's still sort of good and evil. Like it's not as cut and dried, but somehow in my, like when I first started writing, people like, what do you write? Do you write grimdark? And I was like, no, I write not grimdark. And I was like, that's so stupid. I don't have a word for it until people started talking about classic fantasy and
Right.
high fantasy. I was like,
Right.
oh, that's what I
Yeah.
write. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever
I
not
think, like,
grimdark is. So
what you just said, no, it's all good. What you just said there, Janice, like, because I've been thinking about this ever since I got that email, because my brain is obsessive, and what you just said there, like, gets it so well. I think classic fantasy was born for a need for categorization because it was just fantasy, and grimdark came around. People were like, well, what's the other one? What's the one that I'm used to? And I think it's interesting when people are talking here what the differences are to everyone. And for me, when I look at it, I do think there's a difference between the classics of fantasy and classic fantasy, but they're intertwined. So we have the classics like Madupe was mentioning, like Magician and Feist, and was mentioning, you know, Tolkien and everyone that we know. And I think for me, classic fantasy is, it's like it's a feel and it's a genre at the same time, and it's like this warmth and nostalgia is what it triggers for people. And that's what I expect when I see classic fantasy. I expect that warmth and nostalgia. And the reason that people ask, is it from the 80s or the 90s, is because that's where the vibe comes from. That's what we know is classic fantasy to us. And what we're commonly told our writing is, most people I know in this kind of area, is classic fantasy with a modern narrative. And so we get the feels and the vibes and the tones of the books that we grew up with, but with a more modern narrative. And that's where that grittiness between grimdark can come in too, because the more modern narrative is usually more character centric and usually has a more realistic feel, so a grittier feel, but not as nihilistic as a lot of grimdark is. And I think that's the difference in tone. Whereas grimdark focuses on the darkness in people, classic fantasy focuses, whether you're gritty or whether bad things happen, classic fantasy focuses on the light in people. It focuses on the hope. And that difference, you could have a shitty world with horrible things happening, but in classic fantasy, the narrative scope is usually focused on the good people.
Yeah, your central character, you might have characters that are darker around, you know, other POVs or secondary characters.
Oh, you can have shit ton of them.
Typically, your main character, your main hero, is typically not as conflicted as what you will find in a darker grimdark novel, for sure. Like they are usually striving against something and trying to overcome something.
I think even the modern,
to stay good despite all what's happening.
Yeah, I think even in the more modern style, there's loads of conflict, just like in grimdark. But the focus is on the opposite end. The focus is like what you just said, is pushing, is that those characters finding the light inside all the darkness can be a very strong theme in modern classic fantasy.
Yeah. What about like kind of things being explicit? I guess that goes into being like gritty. Like I think to some extent, I think we're all writing similar tone in terms of like kind of what you might call the age range, right? So I think something that separates the high fantasies, the epics, like that we're kind of writing from, something like that might be considered grimdark, is that we don't necessarily have, there might be a lot of swearing, depends what you want, but there might not be as much, there might not be as explicit sex. So the violence, if it's there, it's a little bit toned down, partly because we're trying to, this vibe is about stepping one step away from reality towards the myth and the legend. So by not being too grounded in that sense, you can make it seem larger than life, that you escape towards something that feels more like a legend. How do we feel about that? Do you think that applies? Obviously, it's a spectrum, right? Like some people are going to have it be way grittier, but still be within the same ballpark. But what do we think of that? Do we think the tone in that sense is important?
I think it's very malleable. I have like heavy graphic violence in mine, but there's absolutely no graphic sex, mostly because I can't write it. Like I'm bad
Not with that attitude.
when it comes to
not that attitude.
But
Next
regards to
book.
those three points, like I have a fair amount of cursing, like a lot, because my natural inclination is towards fuck, and some very heavy, like, because when I go into the battle scenes and the war, I focus very deeply on the graphic horror of war and how there are no positives to it. And so, like, I will have scenes. There's a scene in book 3 where they literally walk through a war camp after a battle, and it's horrific. So it's the stuff that I do like to focus on. I think there's a huge spectrum on that, but I don't think you're totally wrong, because you go back, like, Tolkien and what we would have considered classic fantasy usually is pretty clean, especially from a sex perspective. I think that's why romantasy gets separated out, because we compare the other genres to classic fantasy by our need for comparison all the time.
Yeah. So tonally, we kind of have a vibe there, an idea of being we're talking about heroes' journeys, things feeling kind of epic, legendary. Generally speaking, good central characters trying to strive to stay good despite all that's happening around them, and trying to overcome that darkness and face that darkness. Now, here's an interesting question: does it have to be a secondary world? Do you think you could write this in the real world? Does it have to be secondary?
My gut reaction is yes. No, but my gut reaction is that it needs a secondary world. But I don't know if that's just because my preference towards, I was picking up a book that was marketed as classic fantasy, and then I opened it up and page 1 starts in New York. I don't know if my brain could put the two together. Like, maybe it's my expectations, but personally, I feel like it does need that secondary world, but that could just be for what I like to read rather than what I like to write.
I feel like, if it was, go ahead.
No, you first.
I do feel like if it was in our world, either our world would have to be so shifted that it includes magic or magical creatures or something, or it has to be historical. Like, I feel like I'd end up throwing it into a different genre. It would be some kind of urban fantasy if it was a modern world, but with magical realism stuff going on. Or I'd end up with, like, a historical fiction if we're talking Camelot or some maybe historical Asian culture or something. I think you can have that sort of heroic journey story in our world. But if I feel like, I don't know that I can think of one anyway that would qualify as classic fantasy if it was in our world.
Yeah, I think as soon as you use the word classic fantasy, that is a trigger that will go into some people's heads. And I think the one of the best subversions for me they've ever read, and there's spoilers, but like, if you haven't read the book at this stage, like, it's been out like decades, like Wheel of Time, is as you go through Wheel of Time, that when you go through the series, they start finding things. So it's Wheel of Time is very classic fantasy. But then as you go through the series, they find like a Mercedes logo, and they start finding small hints that this used to be our world and it got destroyed. And that subversion is really cool. But if they'd started off with the knowledge that this was, London, it wouldn't have fit in that same feel and vibe. It's a promise. When you say classic fantasy, like Phil was saying, you make a promise to the reader to expect a certain thing, a certain kind of vibe at the very least, a vibe, tone. And I think you've hit the nail when it comes to it being a secondary world fantasy as well. For me, I'm sure there's obviously someone who'll disagree, like always, but that's how I feel with it anyway.
We should let Phil talk in that person's voice and tell us what they would say.
It could be whatever I want it to be.
I do think
mode pace when you go.
Yeah, I think there's space for portal fantasy. I just wanted to mention that because Narnia is portal fantasy, really, and I would class Narnia as classic fantasy. So I think that's the exception, is because I agree. I expect a secondary world, but it doesn't have to be the only world. So that's what I wanted to add.
That's actually such a good one.
Yeah. where does something like the Arthurian legends sit then? Because it's kind of a grey area.
I think Amazon invented a category just for that.
Just for
like I literally, there's the Arthurian fantasy category,
which is stuffed with the gunnels of romantasy.
Yeah, that's a good question actually, because it straddles the line between historical and, I mean, I love Arthurian stuff. I don't really read a lot of historical stuff, but I will read anything Arthurian. So I do think it straddles the line. I guess it's because there's so much mystery around the Arthurian legends. Like there's about 3 or 4 different people that were probably Arthur, and there's quite a few different myths that have been meshed together for what we know, and a lot of the modern understanding of Arthur comes from sort of classical French literature. So it is a real sort of hodgepodge. So I think it maybe is so divorced from the origins of the history that we can kind of see it as fantasy.
I genuinely do think a lot of people would see it as its own genre. Like they genuinely would think this is an Arthurian style book. You know, I'm gonna, because that's what I see when the new films come out. It's a new film about Arthur. But Arthur is barely even in some of them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point actually, because if you have something with, say, knights, a group of knights in, people will relate it to Arthur. So maybe it is transcended.
I'd just like to open the book and find a map that you can't find anywhere else.
That's a great trigger. That's like
And I do think
so we definitely need maps.
Yes, and with the portal fantasies, I do feel like even the part in our real world should have that same vibe that we're talking about. Like the Narnia ones, the part where they're in England, there's still the professor's strange mansion and the different things that they're exploring, right? There's still a vibe to it that feels right.
If that was 2023 New York apartment, it wouldn't feel the same.
That's a really interesting point, because, you know, in The Magician's Nephew, Jadis, she comes back, I think, at the end. And I really found that part really messed with my head. And I think it's because the portal was going the other way. I was sort of like, this can't be happening. It needs to be, the secondary world needs to be the focus. So that's quite interesting, because I didn't like that part, even though it's quite entertaining seeing her, you know, ride around London. So, oh, there's an interesting point about curse words here. Made up curse words.
Made up curse words.
I actually saw that.
Here we are. Let's bring it up. Oh, look at that.
Oh God, no, absolutely never. And I actually got an email of a reader a while back, and I responded to this because he was asking why I didn't make up curse words, and saying that basically he was saying that the book wasn't appropriate for YA readers because I curse a lot in it, and why didn't I make up curse words? And so my response to that, which is the same now, is that for me, in a book that depicts heavy graphic violence and war and death, it felt extremely disingenuous to take out curse words and to filter curse words, but not to filter the graphicness of how horrible death and war is. And I felt like if we were filtering curse words and not that, then we were teaching young people the wrong thing. We were teaching them that saying fuck is bad, but decapitating someone is totally fine. And for me, I felt like I'm not writing for YA readers, but I'm sure YA readers are well able to read the series. But at the same time, I'm not going to shy away from those things, because I think it's a very disingenuous way to bring young readers into a world and teaching them the wrong things. So that was very much a conscious decision. And also, every time I read like Robert Jordan's curse words and Brandon Sanderson's curse words, I cringe a lot. And I love Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. And I just physically just go, ugh.
Sparks.
I think that those made up curse words take away the catharsis that the curse word provides. So they're pointless.
Right. It doesn't mean anything.
It's the same intent without the
I think there's one exception though, is Battlestar Galactica. I think their curse would work. Yeah.
Well, see, there was an interesting one I saw a while ago, and it was actually, I can't remember now the exact definition of it, but apparently curse words ending on certain types of syllables provide the same catharsis for a reason. So frack works because it's fuck. Blood and Ashes doesn't, because like it's weird. Someone went through, I can't remember, it was a Reddit post obviously, and they went through it like in very, very deep detail, and it really worked. It was amazing.
We're sort of drifting into a couple of questions I wanted to touch on, but I probably should say for anyone watching, if you do have questions on the topic or for anyone here, just pop them into the chat. If I notice them, I'll bring them up and we'll deal with those questions as we go. So feel free to fire in your questions as well. But touching on all that fucking and cursing, how can classic fantasy, if we're writing it or maybe if we're reading it, how can we introduce those darker, grittier elements? How can we keep it balanced so that it doesn't lose the appeal of the vibe that we've talked about? Like, how do we bring that stuff in to the extent that we want to but without losing what makes the classic story appealing? I'll pick on someone if you don't jump in.
I just don't want to keep talking all the time.
Philip, come on, Philip.
I think it's actually quite hard to answer. I think in some weird way, I think we all, as authors, have maybe like an instinct for what is too far. I think we all have a template in our head for what we're writing in terms of the themes. We all obviously have adult themes. The YA ship can get involved, but the themes are for adults. And I think we all kind of know the line that you cross where suddenly you're describing something and you just think, oh, it's just pointlessly graphic. Like, what am I trying to achieve here by telling you exactly what you're seeing or smelling or hearing? Do you know what I mean? It's like when you books. I've read some fantasy books where they get into torture, and for me, I'm like, I can do the whole, questioning someone quite physically to get the answers out of them. I can't read is a literal torture, and it's, for me, it's just there's just like an instinctual kind of, this is as far as I can go with this description. I think the reader gets it. The readers must be getting it because they're already reading my stuff. So I feel like we have this kind of back and forth already. I find it quite hard to describe how I would tell someone else not to cross that line. I feel like we all just know where that is. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. I think we'd be in a different roundtable talking about a different genre.
I think you kind of hit the nail there, Phil. A big thing about it is the promise and expectations you set for your reader. So, like, you can have a really, really gritty fantasy, but as long as when you start writing the book and a reader enters it, you make the promise of what the tone of the world is going to be, and that's what you do with your writing. So it's like anything, you got to be careful what you promise and what the expectations are from that promise when you start writing a book. Like, in your first few pages, in your first chapter, in your first 5 or 6 chapters, you're setting a tone and a promise for your readers. You can dip into really gritty things. You can go where you want to go as long as you keep that promised tone and expectation where it should be based on what you've already written in this series. It's when I've seen it a few times where it jars me, where I read this fantasy that I'm loving. It's set this gray tone and yeah, this is the tone I want. And then all of a sudden it gets fucked. It goes crazy. And you're like, I like this still, but it's not the book I wanted to read at this time.
So in fact, it sounds like you want to find the level that you feel comfortable with, and then you want to maintain that consistently. You don't want to jar too much either direction, right? Because you're setting a promise of your tone. If it gets broken, either by becoming far too light or far too dark very, very quickly, like, it'll throw people off. But you can kind of set the bar where you want initially, and then just kind of be steady. Yeah,
like I have, like my books are very much classic fantasy. You go into like the first book, it's like very kind of farm boy trope, the stuff that grounds you and gives you that nostalgia that you look for. But I will set the tone pretty damn quickly that there's going to be some graphic violence, there's going to be some dark stuff. And then when it comes up and keeps going later on, it doesn't jar a reader as much. At least, well, I hope that's the idea, is that it doesn't. Unless they all secretly hate it, but that could definitely be a thing.
Janice, you disappeared for a second there. Do you have something to jump in with now?
Janice Houdini Andrews.
I did, and I may have to like disappear again in a second to find a charging cord. But I do think that at least for me, like as an author, I think sometimes it's really nice to be able to make like almost a contract with your readers, right? Like when you pick up a Sanderson book, it doesn't matter if you're picking up one of his fantasy books, the sci-fi, whatever. There's a tone, right? You're getting a Sanderson book. And I think there are authors that definitely jump around among tone and things like that. But I do think it's sort of it's easier to build a career probably if whatever tone you put in your first book and series, you keep that going. So mine are not YA. Most of my main characters are middle-aged people dealing with like middle-aged people problems. But my first series was very clean because I wanted to write it so my kids could read it whenever, even though it's not written for kids or YA. And so I just made the decision that that's how it's going to stay. So we talk about like death and war and loss and all these things, but it ends up being on a more personal level. Like, what does it mean to someone whose family was killed in a war even 10 years ago? And, you know, are they still dealing with it? And what kind of things that are going on in their lives right now, just like come back to that. So I do think you can be gritty. Like if your first book is really gritty or really goes into the violence or language or whatever it is that you set, I think it like people know when they pick up one of Ryan's books now what they're going to get. And I do
the next one, then I'm gonna fuck with their heads.
And then we'll see them all like yelling on Twitter. But yeah. So
someone actually
made a point there.
Someone mentioned Joe Abercrombie, and I think a couple of people have about marrying grit with classic fantasy. And I think it's interesting to talk about him because I don't read a huge amount of grimdark, but I do read his books. And they are quite nihilistic, and they are quite they are quite grim. But I was trying to work out why I enjoy them in a way that I don't enjoy certain other types of grimdark, and I think it's because of the tone of the prose is quite comedic. So I think to go with the person's point here about how he marries classic fantasy with more grimdark elements, I think for me it is all about the tone, because some, especially as the series go on, it does get more, there is more and more on-page violence, but I just enjoy his cynicism so much, and there are quite a lot of classic elements in there underneath the sort of very all humans are terrible and the world is doomed stuff. There are quite a lot of classic elements under there, so yeah, it's interesting to mention him anyway.
He's a particularly interesting one because I would never put his stuff as classic fantasy for a lot of the reasons. But he, like he said, he's loads of the classic undertones. But the reason he's particularly interesting is because I think Joe Abercrombie, his books aren't classic fantasy marrying grit and humor. They're almost the deconstruction of classic fantasy. Joe Abercrombie was the reason classic fantasy needed to be invented, because he gave enough familiar tones that people got confused. People were like, oh, oh God, that doesn't happen in oh, Jesus Christ. And, you know, so I think when he came around, he was the deconstruction. He was the reason classic fantasy, not just him, but the birth of a genre. He's considered by a lot of people to be kind of like the birth of the commercial grimdark. A really successful grimdark author. And he has loads of classic undertones. And he was it before kind of went over the hill to the, hey, let's just have 150 pages of just torture, even though he does have Glocta. So he's a really interesting one. He's really cool. I love Joe Abercrombie.
I love listening. I love the style and stuff, but I agree with Motherpay that I think it's the endings for me. I've only gone through the first trilogy, but the way that ended it's just not my cup of tea, right? And I think that's the same way with, like, obviously the ending of Game of Thrones totally jumped the shark, but even if you had executed that very well, it really undermines everything that's come before. It kind of kind of, to me, sometimes these sorts of stories get so subversive, the endings feel a bit pointless to me. Like, why did I go through this journey when the ending got us nowhere at all?
I
So
think that's why
wonder
we write
whether-
classic fantasy. Like,
Right.
we expect
But-
an ending or something. The characters you've grown to love actually have something fucking decent happen at the end.
I mean, it doesn't need to be happy, clappy, or cheesy, but just like all that you've gone through seems to have had a point. I don't want to like feel like I've wasted my time.
Just don't make all
No,
17 characters fucking miserable on the last page.
Yeah.
And you
So-
all get
so-
nothing that you wanted.
The one thing about how Game of Thrones ended, because I'll go off on one and it'll derail the entire point of this conversation.
I will just add a lot of why that didn't work for me is because it was just so rushed. We could have.
Oh
I
no,
feel that we
I
could have
think we
got
definitely
there.
agree.
I think we could have had similar things happen. It's just it was so concertinaed because.
Oh, no,
of-
you could see it. Like when you go back to the previous, we're going to go off on a different one, so we will stop. I agree with Phil.
Yeah.
You can see in the first few seasons where he threads the breadcrumbs to allow himself to do that at the end. But then the problem was you get to the last season and the first 3 episodes, she's like loving to John and compassionate, and she's talking to him, she's understanding, and her mental frame is really solid. And then out of nowhere, we always see her with her eyes red, and she always looks like she hasn't slept in like 7 weeks, and she's going psycho. And you're like, when did this flip happen? We know you could have done it well, but you didn't. So now we don't know what's happening.
That was a problem just all the way through the show, though, because I mean, it's a little more. You get it in the books a bit more. It's not quite as. But in the show, it was like whenever Daenerys did something, they put on the hero music, and the music would swell and the dragons would roar, and it was.
Have you ever
framed
crucified
like
someone
she was
to
a
hero music? She has.
Like she's presented as that all the way through. There wasn't a sense of, ooh, is this a bit, ooh, it was all like, no, she's amazing, she's the hero. And then 180 right in, like, as you say, like the last 2 episodes or something.
I do think they did.
So,
They
the whole way
did
through,
do that
it did set up
little.
all.
They did do it reasonably in the show, because I think like he did that, like where she crucifies all the masters of Marine, and then you go and to the hero music, like you said. I think that's done intentionally, because then you go back over to the other narrative where they're in the small council and they're like, she crucified 100 people along a road. Like they go through all the horrible things she's done, and you're like, oh wow, without the music, that's not nice.
Let's not go. We will all probably have.
Oh yeah,
like 5 hours
this will be a
worth
Game of Thrones panel.
deep diving. Yeah. I would like to chip in my 2 cents on like how you can add in the grittier, darker stuff without losing some of that vibe we've talked about. I mean, Songs of Chaos is quite a clean written story that isn't swearing. There is no sex. The violence is there, but a little. I pull it back a peg. There's some horror. I pull that back a peg too. But I like to make sure that if I want to lean into something, it's like the emotional maturity and the emotional darkness. Like if the reader gets really raw emotional feels out of what the character's going through, it doesn't need to be hyper explicit or hyper graphic. Because if you can make them feel what's happening, like you don't need to necessarily, put in all that stuff around it. And so you can, I think a lot of the time it's by making sure the emotions are being dealt with maturely and grittily, if that makes sense. We don't necessarily need to always go as explicit as other people may do with darker stories. That's kind of how I like to try and balance it up. So I throw that out there because we hadn't touched on that one quite yet. So I wonder whether, it does seem like for a long time, like, as you said, Joe Abercrombie kicked things off with it was Game of Thrones, the Angel, and it all kind of, Joe kind of doubled down a bit on the grimdark stuff. Do we, and then it seemed like for a long time publishing, especially coming out of the traditional houses, got darker and darker, but get darker and darker by degrees. But there was one guy who was always writing stuff that wasn't that, and that was Sanderson. So do we think that, like, in an era where everyone said, no, everyone wants this dark stuff, the guy who was kind of dug his heels in and wrote the kind of classic stuff has become, the powerhouse, like, so that it has this much wider appeal than people think? Do we think this is just ebbs and flows? Do we think that that the classic fantasy is therefore so timeless that's why Sanderson it's become Sanderson. That's why we're all writing this stuff. Like it's people are always looking for it. Do you think?
I kind of like to think of it. There's loads of ways to think of it, but if not that many people, or if you have like fucking 1,000 people who like chocolate, and everyone else in the world says they don't like chocolate, and all of a sudden we start getting less chocolate and less chocolate and less chocolate and less chocolate, and only one chocolate factory produces chocolate, that chocolate factory is going to get a lot of fucking money. And I think that's the way I look at it in this regard. When a lot of the and it's what happens. It's part of the publishing industry. It's what makes publishing industry so weird, is that they chase trends so fucking hard that they leave huge gaps that are really good money makers, because a lot of the publishing tactics with bigger publishers can be perceived as more of a spaghetti on the wall approach. They'll take loads of books in a certain genre, throw them out, see which ones float, and then push their sequels. So that kind of bred a weird environment where even right now you can see a very heavy chase on romantasy and dragon riders. So both of those are happening right now. And they were driven by the indie scene. You can see it very clearly when you're watching the two markets. And so I think like in the same with Sanderson, publishers were producing loads and loads. And there's other people at Sanderson, but he's just such a massive, like, what's the word? Monolith in the industry right now. But when everyone was feeding loads of grimdark, he just kept producing what he was producing. And those readers then had less places to go to as well. And they had to go to the smaller, and Sanderson's not smaller, but the smaller quantity of published books in those genres, and they just keep growing. It's weird now because it's 4 people instead of 5.
I think I agree about Sanderson, and I do see on readers groups people liking his work for those reasons, and it'll be the same people that talk about some of the names that have been mentioned earlier from the 80s and 90s. I do also think with him, I don't think there are many people writing the kind of magic systems that he creates, so I do think that's part of it as well. So I think the grittier tone is part, his non-gritty tone is part of it, but I also think it's to do with his magic systems, which I think there's not many people doing that.
No,
doing systems like that,
or his concepts. Like who the fuck sits there, right, and goes, let's go have these fucking warriors powered by weird floaty tangible emotions fighting 200-foot monster crabs in storms that kill everything and trees that pull into rocks. Anyone else comes up with that, they don't write the story.
And also the rhythm, the Pashendi, I forget what their actual name is, but their rhythm way of talking, of conveying emotions through the choice of rhythms. I'm like, that's so unique and clever, and I'm thinking, how would you ever translate that to the screen? Not that you would necessarily want to, but my mind's always thinking like that. I'm like, how could you do it? And you couldn't. And that's part of what I think is its brilliance.
I mean, he's mad. Like what I would say with a lot of stuff is Brandon Sanderson to me is probably one of the best. And I haven't read too much of his stuff. I've read a lot of the Wheel of Time stuff, and I'm in the middle of reading his Awakening stuff now. But he is an absolute master at executing the insane things, making the ideas that don't make sense and actually make them work. He's a master at that. The execution of that is incredible. I think that does play a massive part in his success as well. Yeah, he's successful because he's damn fucking good, but he's also, he's got to feed off that too. Feed off being one of the biggest kind of classic-y vibe fantasy authors around.
Yeah,
I feel like a bad author. I've never read Sanderson. Obviously, heard of him. I haven't been living under a rock. I did see an interview though that he did once where he said they really struggled to. They've approached him several times to make TV shows and films and stuff out of his books, but they've struggled to convince him that they can do it right. Which just about what you were just saying there about how they could translate that to things that are really hard.
Yeah, I don't think it could be done.
I think that's Brian Anderson in the group, the Renegade Bard. I'm pretty sure, and he's an absolutely hilarious bastard. But he made a very, very good point as well there about Sanderson and how he's a deep understanding of story structure. But one of the other ones I think gets overlooked a lot is combined with a near abnormal compulsion to produce material. So we're in this weird area where when basically you have Game of Thrones unfinished, I will never side with anyone who tells him to shut up and finish his books because I understand how hard it is. Game of Thrones unfinished, and then you have Patrick Rothfuss with his unfinished series, and it's only one or two out of thousands, tens of thousands of authors, hundreds of thousands of authors, because there's a high profile. We have actually entered an area where someone who consistently produces, finishes, and publishes books at a steady rate can actually lift their career on that merit alone. Simply by continuous production of quality material, you will gather readerships. Like I've seen it so often, so many times. If a reader feels like they can rely on you to continuously produce, they will stick with you. Like, and I think you see it a lot more in the indie sphere solely because indies have control of their release patterns. So, you know, you could have an indie who releases 5, 6, 7 books in a year, or 10 books in 3 years. Whereas even if a trad author has 10 books written, the chances of their publisher allowing them to publish all 10 books in the next 2 years is probably going to be pretty small. So they don't get the benefit of that, you know, consistent quick release. So you see it a lot in indies where you can build a back catalog very quickly. And if you do it, you can get readers that you would never have gotten if you only released one a year or one every 2 years or one every 3 years. It was a really, really interesting one. Sanderson's obviously a freak in the best way.
Right. Obviously, I asked the question because we're sort of talking about classic fantasy, and we're sort of trying to figure out why, in quotes, it still resonates today. As if, you know, I always think that's sort of like, do we need to ask that question? I've always felt it was kind of obvious why it would resonate today, but it kind of illustrates the point, right? That, you know, he is so massive in part because he's continuing in this tradition. Like, he's modernized it in his way. He's added his hard magic. He has the crazy world building, but the how the stories end, how they wrap up, the vibe and promises that he makes are very much in that kind of slightly older tradition. He wasn't following the darker stuff, the nihilistic stuff. There is always some hope in there. At least the stuff that I've read, right? And that's kind of where I was going. That, like, so, you know, why we've gone around, talked about a lot of different stuff. Let's try and see if we can touch just on the question itself, which is like, why does all of this still resonate? Like, why do we still like all this? What is it that appeals so much about this style of storytelling, even to this day?
I think, like you were just saying about hope there, and we were saying at the start when we were talking about the difference between classic and grimdark, is what the narrative focuses on. And I think that's actually why Joe Abercrombie gets compared to classic a lot, because his narrative focus, although nihilistic, you have characters who never give up. And you have like Logan Ninefingers, who is a murderous, horrible human being, but at the same time, you root for him because he just is not giving up, and he's probably going to do some of the right things. And I think for me, why it resonates for me, and I still want to read it, is because of that narrative focus on hope. And it's the same reason why a lot of people get into classic fantasy is escapism, and people are always going to want to escape from the real world. Whereas grimdark reminds you of the horrors of real world. A lot of classic fantasy, not all of it, tends to have quite a bit of escapism. And the focus, that refreshing focus for me on, even in a dark world where horrible things are happening, that there are characters who might not be clearly good or clearly bad, but they're clearly just trying to save the ones they love, clearly just trying to make through in the world and kind of be a decent person, whether that ends up working out or not. For me, that's why it continues to resonate, because it always has that escapism, always has that tone of hope, and it's a kind of genre that people turn to when they want to find hope. And yeah, but that's for me anyway.
I think that's like bang on, really, because I think classic fantasy, or I think if you come into a fantasy, if you like fantasy the genre, you're looking for a story of good versus evil. And classic fantasy has that just like right to the point. You know, it's always good versus evil, with a theme of hope running all the way through. The light will beat the dark. and I know that's a massive concept in all my books, is that like hope. I think even beyond fantasy, I think maybe even as a human race, we're always looking for that thread of hope and for the good. Classic fantasy just, it holds all that.
Please tell us we won't nuke each other in the end.
I think that's right, what you said about it being something within us. I think back to what I was saying earlier about classic fantasy being most closely related to mythology, which I see as the oldest form of storytelling. I think part of it is that. Part of it is also our nature as human beings and why we consume stories. So I've read some interesting things saying the reason we the reason we consume stories is it's a survival thing. So we want to know how we would cope in a given situation. So we have that knowledge. And I think that because this is about very, very high stakes, terrible things happening, and then it's all okay in the end, that appeals to something within us, which is about survival, where, you know, we want to gather this information, that lizard brain wants to gather that bit of information. So I feel that, you know, obviously I'm a fantasy writer, so I'm going to say it's, you know, it's the purest form of literature and the best, but I do feel that it is closest to the stories we would be telling us each other around the campfires, you know, since time.
I totally agree. There is I don't know what the term is, but there's something like how we learn better from stories than necessarily always practical experience. Like your brain makes a story out of something sometimes to like understand how something's working, and like when you get into the big epic fantasy where you throw it out to the myth and you make stakes massive, it just becomes representative of existential stuff, like in real life, how nature is trying to kill us, and eventually we're all caught in, like, you know, these existential problems that press on us all the time, and we are just, to go back to, you know, Lord of the Rings, we are just little hobbits, and so if we can, if we can see other hobbits walking up the hill.
6'4".
You're frost troll. You're different. There is no legend for you. Yeah, if we're that little hobbit, if we see the little hobbit succeed against the existential dread power, you know, like it gives us that. It gives us that ability to kind of stand up in real life, or it can, and face up to what's going on.
Well, I completely agree with you. I'm just laughing at how often you've managed to say the word hobbit.
Hobbit. I think that over the past few years too, there's been a big resurgence just since the pandemic and everything. I feel like as humans, if we're in a bad place, we're looking for hope. We're looking for, like, is this going to last forever? Or do I stand a chance to get out of this? Will something end up better than where I am now? And when the whole world suddenly is in this bad place, and then, you know, we have wars and all sorts of stuff going on. I do think they're, like, with the cozy fantasy that showed up too in the last little while, like, the worst things are outside. The more we need this story told to us again and again and again, that the human spirit can overcome really horrible things that seem too big, you know, that are mythologically big. But, you know, really it's almost that, the whole farm boy trope, right? Who just, like, doesn't know what he's doing, but just keeps trying, and ends up, or the Hobbit, and ends up taking out, you know, like, every force of evil that could stand against him. And I just think we want that story. And then the world has gotten pretty dark, so we want it more.
I think the only balance we've had now is it's not just a farm boy. You can have a farm girl. You can have a farm anything. You can have a farm. The whole point is, now we have a world where we can tell all the stories, but the concept remains the same. Like you're saying, the concept of having that person who is small, insignificant to the stakes of the world, being able to stand up and find family inside that world and protect the people they love, and, you know, fight the challenges that we face. And that's, classic fantasy. I love classic fantasy. I'm always going to love this stuff.
Yeah, you notice in those stories, often everything is around the hero, whoever the main character is, gets sort of progressively worse, and somehow it lands on their shoulders to do something about it. And even though they don't always want to, they have to kind of shoulder it and stand up straight and walk forward against it anyways. I just think that does speak to what we all go through day to day, even if we're not literally fighting big battles. There's stuff going around us all the time whether it's illness in the family or something like that, anything, that eventually you just have to sort of be like the hero and stand up and take one more step and another step and another step. And I just think we really like seeing people do that over and over again. And it's why like the heyday of the Marvel movies were all like that, right? And then they kind of got a bit funky lately. But the kind of the peak of those movies
it's not a
the peak of those movies
unless the
was
character
Captain
falls
America.
down.
Yeah, well,
Sorry,
the peak of those movies, right, was Captain America standing facing Thanos' entire army on his own with a broken shield. He just gets up anyway. He can't win, but he just gets up anyway. That's the peak of
On your
that.
left. On your left.
Yeah.
Well, while you were making that profound statement, a comment came in, and that wasn't sarcastic, it was really profound. A comment came in and says, "What if the farm itself was the hero all along?" And I just started laughing.
Someone needs to write that story now.
Andrew, you need to write that story then. Yeah.
But isn't that the peak of all stories? Home is what you're fighting for. Home is the hero all along. Home is the comfort you're yearning for, the thing you want to protect.
But doesn't the home always get burned at the beginning? Like,
Not always, and I think like it does happen. But then you learn that home's where the heart is.
We always do.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. Well,
I
I'm
love, by the
conscious
way,
of
Michael,
everyone's time. Yeah.
that your book's displayed, right? But on a prominent podium, the thing displayed on its own is Travis Baldry's books.
I'm very happy.
How much were you paid?
Broken Binding. I wish. Yeah, it's just a freebie for. Somebody set this up. There's also a Pikachu proudly displayed.
Oh no, trust me, I saw
Tokyo,
Pikachu.
Yeah.
And R2D2,
And
which I have
R2D2.
too. You see, mine's hiding behind books. I don't have my shelves up.
Sentiment.
Oh, he normally is, but I have shelves to put up. I just haven't had the time.
Right. On that beautiful note about R2D2 and Lego, I'm conscious that it's been about an hour of everyone's time. I think that's been really generous of everyone to come and take that time. I think we can probably close it there, but we'll close by, remind everyone who you are, what you write, where they can find you, and we'll start with Modepe and then kind of go around clockwise.
I think we all see different pictures, but yes.
Do we? Well, I'll tell you who's going
You can. I'm Ayinde on all the social media, everything. My book is called A Song of Legends Lost. It's due out in spring 2025. It's set in a world where you can summon your ancestors in battle, and it's very much written in the epic fantasy tradition, although the world itself has a lot of spins on that. Yeah, that's me.
Brilliant, thank you.
Will I get a map? Is there a map? Will I open the book and see a map?
There is a map. There has to be a map. There, if I'm lucky, I'll get more than one map, but there will definitely be at least one.
you just feels like, well, it's not a map. I'm not reading that.
It's like that Brooklyn Nine-Nine scene that gets memed a lot, where she wants the binder. If there's a binder, you need to lead with that. You would, that's Phil with his map. Moving to Ryan.
Oh yeah, sweet. So I'm Ryan Cahill, and the quickest way to find me, this is my favorite thing ever that I got to say to my mom, is just Google me. That's so cool. It's because my website comes up first, and it has like all the Twitter and shit. So, but
we advise you put safe search on though.
Oh, what other fucking words are you adding?
Just your name, man. You don't.
Let's put it out here, guys.
Pretty dark stuff. Pretty grim dark stuff.
Michael may write clean books, but that's not what his search history says. So on that note, I'm going to pass it on.
Let's go to Phil.
Philip E. Quaintrell, and I've written the Echo Saga, the Ranger Archives, currently writing the Time of Dragons. You can find me. I have a website. You can find me by Googling me. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find. I think I'm the only Quaintrell you'll find on Google. So,
what's your home address?
Unusual. I don't even that myself.
I actually believe him there.
Thanks, Phil. And Janice?
J.A. Andrews, you can actually, if you Google me, there's 2 other J.A. Andrews authors, but they don't write fantasy. So ignore them and just look for fantasy. My stories are all about
I'm just
keepers.
imagining someone finding romantasy or something and being like, Janice, I didn't know this was your type of stuff.
No, they're like thrillers and stuff that they write. And I'm on Kickstarter right now. I'm plugging my Kickstarter book because look, okay, so this is my last one. Can I make it shine? Kind of. But look, Phil, just for you. Big old
Look at
color
that.
map
It's
right
killer
there.
as well.
And
look at that.
And a different one in the back, colored. So
I'm still waiting for my copy to arrive, so I'm just sitting here like, because I'm in New Zealand, so it takes like 12 years.
You live so far away. You live in the wrong part of the world. So how about you?
Wow. Okay.
Well, I guess we'll bring this to a close. I am Michael R. Miller. I write Songs of Chaos series, which is a big Dragon Rider epic fantasy, much in the vibe as we've been discussing. And you can find me at my website, which is just my name, michaelrmiller.co.uk. Nice and easy. So I'd like to thank all of my fellow panelists for being here. Thanks for giving up your time on a Saturday night or Sunday morning for Ryan over there. And thank you everyone for watching. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your comments. It's been really fun. And look forward to doing this again sometime, hopefully. So see you guys later.
Thank you. Bye.
Go team.
Bye-bye.
Bye.